Naomi had always been told she couldn't, but she had never believed them. "You're not the right fit. You're too loud. This is for people like us, not for people like you." Each remark, each subtle glance that lingered too long, was a reminder that the world Naomi dreamed of was never meant for someone like her. She had always felt out of place, never truly welcomed. Yet it never stopped her from trying, from proving everyone wrong. The sting of those words had fueled her determination to push harder, work longer, and make a name for herself in a world that seemed intent on keeping her on the outside. Every time someone doubted her, Naomi saw it as an opportunity to show them that she belonged, no matter where she came from, no matter what others thought of her. Her childhood had been spent in a cramped apartment in a rough part of town, surrounded by the constant hum of city life. Naomi's mother had worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat, and while Naomi could see the exhaustion in her eyes, her mother never once spoke about it. Instead, she showed Naomi through her actions what it meant to survive. She taught Naomi that hard work paid off, always. That the dreams she had, the dreams of climbing out of poverty and into a world of success, were achievable as long as she worked for it. Her mother's resilience had been a guiding light, and though Naomi could sense the weight of her mother's silent struggles, she never let those hardships define her. Instead, she let them drive her. Naomi didn't have the same advantages as many of her peers. No private tutors, no connections in high places. What she did have was an unyielding work ethic and a fierce desire to make a difference. She studied like it was her only escape, pushing herself through the challenges of school, trying to balance her academic performance with the realities of life. There were times when she had to sacrifice sleep for study, forgoing social events and personal time to make sure her grades were up to par. She didn't have the resources others did, but she was determined to prove that intellect, drive, and perseverance could overcome anything. Her scholarships, earned through late nights and countless cups of coffee, were proof of her grit. And every time she walked across the stage at graduation, each honor was a reminder of the countless obstacles she had overcome. But deep inside, Naomi knew this was only the beginning of her journey. The acceptance letter from law school had felt like an out-of-body experience. She had cried when it arrived, trembling as she read the words. She had made it. But law school wasn't a fairy tale. It was filled with hyper-competitive students, many of whom came from wealthy families, and Naomi quickly realized she wasn't the only one with a burning desire to succeed. It was a pressure cooker, and Naomi, despite being smart and capable, often felt the weight of imposter syndrome pressing on her chest. The fear of failure gnawed at her, making her second-guess her abilities and her place among her peers. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was truly cut out for this life. But each time that doubt crept in, Naomi reminded herself of her mother's words, of the sacrifices they had both made to get this far. She wasn't about to let anything, not even self-doubt, stand in the way of her dreams. Then, when Naomi received the job offer from Smith & Reynolds, one of the most prestigious law firms in the city, she couldn't believe it. It was as though her dreams were finally becoming tangible. The offer wasn't just a job. It was validation that all her sacrifices, all her hard work had paid off. The email was short, but it carried a weight that Naomi felt deep in her bones. She had made it. Finally, she was on the cusp of everything she had worked so hard for. But that moment of triumph was quickly overshadowed by the looming fear of the unknown. Could she really thrive in this new environment? Was she ready to face the challenges that came with being a part of this elite institution? Walking into the firm's sleek office building that first morning, she felt like a tiny speck in an ocean of polished suits and towering skyscrapers. The glass walls gleamed under the harsh lights, and Naomi couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. Everything about the space screamed success. From the marble floors to the gleaming metal fixtures to the perfectly designed modern furniture. It was a world that seemed so far removed from her own. A place where people didn't have to struggle. A place where privilege and power were in abundance. For a moment, Naomi wondered if she truly belonged. But that doubt was fleeting. She had earned her spot here, and she was determined to make the most of it. Margaret Smith, the head of the firm, met her at the door. She was everything Naomi imagined, an epitome of elegance and sharp intellect, with a poised demeanor that commanded attention. Yet, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was an air of condescension beneath Margaret's smile, a subtle recognition that Naomi wasn't one of them. Margaret's gaze swept over Naomi, scrutinizing her appearance with the kind of detachment that Naomi had seen many times before. It was a look that said, "You're here, but we'll see if you can keep up." "Naomi, welcome to the team," Margaret said, her tone cold, her words wrapped in professionalism that felt stifling. "This place is about excellence. We value results, not excuses. Do you understand?" Naomi nodded, her throat tight. She had been prepared for a competitive environment, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The feeling that every glance, every word was a reminder that she was an outsider. Naomi wasn't sure if it was the sharpness in Margaret's tone, or the subtle way her eyes lingered on Naomi, but she couldn't shake the sense that Margaret was sizing her up, wondering how long it would take before Naomi proved herself unworthy of this place. Her first days blurred together as Naomi tried to navigate the chasm between the welcoming messages and the cold treatment she received. There were no real introductions or mentorships, just a cold wave of tasks that piled up. She was given the grunt work, the kind of work that didn't require a law degree, sorting documents, running errands for senior associates, sitting through meetings where her ideas were disregarded, or worse, ignored entirely. The senior associates barely acknowledged her presence, absorbed in their own work, too busy with their own high-profile cases to spare even a passing glance. "I see you're eager," Margaret said one afternoon, after Naomi had worked through her lunch to finish a report. "But don't get too comfortable. You're here to support the real work, not to make waves." Naomi's heart sank. Support. That word lingered in the air, louder than any of Margaret's dismissive comments. Naomi had been hired to be more than just a cog in the machine. She had come here to prove herself, to show that she was more than just a token hire, more than just someone who had checked a box. But the coldness in Margaret's words, the way she made Naomi feel like a mere afterthought, made it difficult to see a way forward. As Naomi spent each day doing the work that no one else wanted to do, her frustration grew. She knew she was capable of so much more, that she had the skills and the intellect to contribute at a higher level. But each time she spoke up in meetings, each time she tried to offer a new idea, her contributions were dismissed, not even given the courtesy of consideration. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. "You're here to support the real work." Naomi wasn't sure how much longer she could endure this treatment. But one thing was certain, she was not about to give up. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles, to let this be the end of her story. Naomi's fire, the one that had gotten her this far, was far from extinguished. If anything, it was just beginning to burn brighter. Naomi's patience was slowly beginning to erode. The constant microaggressions, small, subtle actions and words, had become so frequent that they felt like an unrelenting tide wearing her down. Every day she found herself bracing for the slights she knew would come, the kind of everyday discrimination that no one else seemed to see, but that she felt with a stinging clarity. The senior associates, those seasoned professionals whose voices carried an air of unearned authority, would speak over her in meetings. Their condescending tones made it clear that her opinions, no matter how well-reasoned or insightful, held no weight. It wasn't just that they didn't listen to her. It was the dismissive way they would glance at her, as though she were a mere obstacle in the room. The paralegals, too, treated her with disdain. Every time Naomi asked a question or sought clarification on a task, they rolled their eyes, clearly irritated by the interruption. They, too, had their own unspoken hierarchies, and Naomi felt as though she was at the very bottom. The message was clear and unyielding. You don't belong here, and no matter how hard you try, you never will. Despite it all, Naomi refused to let the weight of these small but cutting actions break her. She held on to the lessons her mother had taught her, that the only way forward was through perseverance. But even for Naomi, the constant stream of these invisible barriers began to take its toll. She started to question how much longer she could endure the subtle yet incessant erosion of her spirit. Then, one evening, everything changed. It was a particularly grueling night at the office, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever, where the clock on the wall was nothing more than a mockery of time. Naomi had been assigned to review case files for a high-profile corporate lawsuit. The case was meant to be a feather in the firm's cap, a chance to cement their dominance in the legal world. The firm was representing a company accused of severe environmental violations, and Naomi was tasked with ensuring that all documentation was in order. As she sifted through the files, her eyes landed on a peculiar detail. Something wasn't right. She double-checked the documents, her mind racing as she flipped through page after page. The case was complex, and Naomi had expected some degree of difficulty in piecing together the facts, but this felt different. Pages seemed to be missing, signatures appeared to be altered, and key pieces of evidence had mysteriously vanished. Naomi felt a jolt of unease, a growing suspicion that there was something far more sinister going on. She began to dig deeper, pulling up additional records, cross-referencing with other files, her pulse quickening as the pieces slowly began to fall into place. There was a pattern here, something that linked these anomalies together, and what it revealed was horrifying. This wasn't just sloppy legal work, it was deliberate. Smith & Reynolds, a firm she had once admired, had been hiding the truth. Her heart raced as the realization hit her. There were payoffs, hush money to local officials. Key evidence had been manipulated, twisted, and buried to protect the company. This was not just a botched case. This was corruption, and it went all the way to the top. The files were filled with coded messages, hidden dealings, and evidence of a cover-up that was far, far worse than Naomi had ever imagined. What she was uncovering was bigger than any individual case. This was about the kind of power that could destroy lives, all for the sake of profit and influence. The more Naomi investigated, the more she realized the extent of the firm's involvement. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't think about anything else. She worked through the nights, sitting in the cold, sterile office, the faint hum of the overhead lights her only company. And then one night, it all came crashing down. She found a sealed report, buried deep within the files, a document that detailed police brutality covered up by the firm. The names of the officers involved were eerily familiar, and Naomi felt a chill run down her spine. These were the same officers she had seen time and time again. The same people who had treated her as though she were invisible. The same ones who had undermined her at every turn. The same people who had built their success on the backs of people like Naomi. People who had been silenced by the system. Her breath caught in her throat as the gravity of what she had uncovered sank in. Naomi had always known, deep down, that something wasn't right. But this was more than just a firm with questionable practices. This was a systemic web of corruption, one that stretched far beyond the walls of the office, entangling every corner of society. The faces she had once considered her colleagues were now nothing more than cogs in a machine built on lies and manipulation. Naomi's mind was in turmoil. She couldn't look away from the truth she had uncovered, but the consequences of exposing it were enormous. What if speaking out meant the end of her career? What if she lost everything? Her job, her reputation, her future. She had no allies in the firm, no one who would stand beside her. She was alone in this fight, with nothing but her determination to keep her going. But as Naomi sat alone in that dark office, staring at the documents in front of her, the faces of the victims haunted her. She thought of the people whose lives had been ruined by the firm's corruption, of the families torn apart by the lies they had spread. She thought of her own mother, who had worked so hard to get Naomi to this point, only to see her dreams shattered by the very people who were supposed to uphold justice. Naomi couldn't turn away. She couldn't pretend that she hadn't seen what she had uncovered. The injustice she had uncovered wasn't just about her. It was about the lives of others, people who had been wronged and whose voices had been silenced. She had a choice. She could remain silent and let the corruption continue, or she could expose the truth and risk everything. There was no turning back now. The decision had already been made. The days that followed Naomi's discovery felt like a haze, a blur of tension and quiet dread that clung to her every waking moment. She could feel the weight of the secret she had uncovered pressing down on her, suffocating her in the very place that was meant to foster her ambitions. Every glance she caught from her colleagues felt like a hidden judgment, their smiles now masked by the corporate facades they had carefully cultivated to protect themselves. Naomi had always been able to read people, but now, more than ever, she felt a disconnect. The people she had once considered peers and potential allies were now distant figures, faceless in the crowd, all of them part of a system she no longer trusted. It wasn't just the firm that felt foreign now. It was the world around her. Naomi had grown up in a rough neighborhood, in an environment that was far from easy. Yet she had always believed that the legal field, with its promise of justice, was different. She had always believed in the ideal of the law as a force for good. But now, that belief felt like a distant memory, clouded by the harsh reality she was facing. Margaret's presence in the office had become a constant reminder of the division between Naomi and the world she had hoped to be a part of. Margaret, the polished, impeccably dressed woman who had welcomed her with a cold smile, had become a symbol of everything Naomi now despised. It was not just the subtle condescension in Margaret's tone or the way she would dismiss Naomi's contributions in meetings. It was the way Margaret seemed to embody the toxic culture Naomi had come to realize existed at Smith & Reynolds. Everything about the firm, from the constant competition to the unspoken power structures, felt like a machine designed to grind people down, to keep them in their place. And now, it seemed that the firm had found a new way to remind Naomi of her position. One morning, as Naomi was sitting at her desk, her eyes scanning over some paperwork, she heard Margaret's voice behind her. Naomi had anticipated this moment, knowing it was only a matter of time before Margaret would come to her with another task. She had become the go-to person for menial work, filing, organizing, running errands. It was a familiar routine, one that Naomi had grown used to, though it never failed to rankle her. She had come to Smith & Reynolds to practice law, to prove herself as an attorney, not as a secretary or a junior clerk. But she also knew that Margaret, and the firm as a whole, had no intention of letting her prove her worth in any meaningful way. The message was clear. Naomi's place was beneath them. As Margaret slid a folder across Naomi's desk, Naomi's eyes narrowed. She didn't need to look at the contents to know that this was a test. Margaret's gaze was cold, appraising, as though she were measuring Naomi's reaction, gauging her response. "You're working on a high-profile case now," Margaret said, her voice smooth, almost too smooth. "It's a sensitive one. Don't disappoint us." The words were laced with a subtle threat, a reminder that Naomi's future at the firm was hanging by a thread. There was no room for mistakes, no room for anything other than complete compliance. Margaret's tone was controlled, but there was a sharp edge to it, one that Naomi had become all too familiar with. This was not just an assignment. This was a warning. Naomi's heart skipped a beat as she flipped open the file. The client's name immediately stood out, and her stomach churned with recognition. The man at the center of this case was someone Naomi had heard of before, someone whose reputation preceded him. He was notorious, not just for his wealth and power, but for the connections he had cultivated with the city's elite. His reach extended deep into the political and law enforcement spheres, making him untouchable. Naomi knew, instinctively, that this was not just another case. This was the same client whose name had been buried in the files she had uncovered, a key player in the web of corruption that had plagued the firm. His involvement in illegal activities, payoffs, and manipulations had been hidden in plain sight, and now Naomi was being asked to represent him. As she read through the details of the case, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. This man, this client, was not just a wealthy businessman. He was a part of the very system Naomi had been uncovering, a system that had allowed corruption to fester unchecked, a system that had trampled on the rights of the vulnerable in favor of power and profit. Naomi felt her breath catch in her throat. The stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about her career anymore. This was about everything she had learned, everything she had fought for. Her mind raced as she tried to process the implications of what she was reading. This was the moment of truth, the defining moment that would shape her future. She had uncovered the truth. She knew the extent of the corruption at Smith & Reynolds, and now she was being asked to take part in it, to contribute to the system that had already caused so much harm. Naomi's hands trembled as she held the file. She had worked her entire life to get to this point, to secure a position at one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. She had sacrificed so much. Her time, her energy, her relationships, all in the name of this dream. She had proven herself, fought through every obstacle, and now it felt as though the dream was slipping through her fingers. The choice before her was agonizing. On the one hand, she could continue down this path, play the part that had been laid out for her, and solidify her place in the world she had always longed to be a part of. She could take on this case, represent this man, and let the firm continue its corrupt practices unchecked. She could maintain the facade, stay quiet, and keep her job, perhaps even rise through the ranks. But at what cost? Naomi knew that staying silent, ignoring the truth she had uncovered, would mean becoming complicit in the very system she had once believed in. It would mean sacrificing her integrity, her morals, and everything she had fought for. On the other hand, she could blow the whistle. She could expose the corruption, reveal the truth about the firm, and risk everything in the process. She could leave the firm, sever ties with the career she had worked so hard to build, and face the inevitable consequences of speaking out. But what would that mean for her future? Would anyone believe her? Would she be ostracized, blacklisted from the legal world forever? Naomi felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her, a weight that seemed almost unbearable. She knew that whatever choice she made, her life would never be the same. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with risk and danger. But she also knew that if she stayed silent, she would be condemning herself to a life of regret, a life where she would always wonder what could have been. Her sense of justice, the very core of who she was, would never allow her to turn away from the truth. In that moment, as the hours passed in a blur of indecision, Naomi realized something. She had never come this far, fought this hard, only to back down now. She had spent her entire life challenging the odds, proving everyone wrong, fighting for a future she could believe in. She wasn't about to let that fight end here. Her decision was made. There was no turning back. Naomi knew what she had to do. The days that followed Naomi's decision were some of the longest and most painful of her life. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Her mind constantly churned with doubt and fear, each thought heavier than the last. Every time she tried to close her eyes, all she could see were the faces of the people she had left behind. The clients, the victims, the workers who had been cheated out of their lives and futures. She thought of the stories she had uncovered, the lies she had unearthed. These weren't just corporate games being played by powerful men. These were lives being destroyed in the pursuit of greed. The life Naomi had fought so hard for, years of school, the endless hours of work, the sacrifice of friendships and personal moments, now seemed to be crumbling before her. Every night, she would lay awake, her heart racing, thinking of the choice she was about to make. What if she was wrong? What if the truth she had discovered wasn't enough to topple the system? What if speaking out meant ruining everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed? She had fought so hard to be here, to make a name for herself in a world that often seemed to disregard her. Yet now, she was standing at a crossroads, knowing that her decision would either cement her place in a world of corruption or tear it all down. In these moments of doubt, Naomi found herself thinking of the victims, the ones who had been lied to, manipulated, and ignored. She thought of the workers who had been hurt by the same company that had once promised them a better future. They were people who had no voice, no power to fight back against the overwhelming force of the corporation's wealth and influence. They were the faceless victims that no one cared about, the ones that Naomi had always imagined in her head as the reason she had wanted to become a lawyer in the first place. But now, those faces were real to her. They weren't just abstract ideals. They were real people whose lives had been irrevocably damaged by the very firm Naomi worked for. And then, there was her mother. Naomi's thoughts always turned to her mother during moments of crisis. She could see her mother's face so clearly in her mind, her hardworking, loving mother who had supported her every step of the way, even when the world seemed to be working against them. Naomi remembered the sacrifices her mother had made to put her through school, the long hours her mother had worked, and the way she would never allow Naomi to quit, no matter how difficult things got. Naomi could almost hear her mother's voice, urging her to do the right thing, to stand up for justice, to break free from the chains of conformity that had always held her back. Her mother's unwavering belief in Naomi gave her the strength to move forward, to take that first step. It was these thoughts of the victims and her mother that kept her going in those dark moments of indecision. Naomi knew that she could not live with herself if she didn't act. She couldn't continue being part of a system that perpetuated injustice, no matter the personal cost. The thought of continuing to work for Smith & Reynolds, continuing to be complicit in the harm they were doing to innocent people, made her sick to her stomach. She knew what she had to do, But the question of how weighed heavily on her mind. Who could she trust? Could she even trust herself to make the right decision? She spent days drafting the email, composing her words carefully, double-checking every piece of evidence, every document. The fear of making a mistake haunted her. One slip-up, one wrong detail, and it could all unravel. But the more she worked, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her career anymore. It was about the truth, about exposing the corruption that had stained everything she had come to know. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of second-guessing, Naomi clicked the send button. The email was out. The evidence, every document, every email, every shred of proof she had painstakingly uncovered was now in the hands of someone who could make a difference. The email had gone to a trusted investigative journalist, someone Naomi had spent hours vetting, someone she believed would use the information to expose the corruption without compromise. She couldn't be sure what would happen next, but in that moment she felt a weight lift from her chest. It was as if the chains that had bound her for so long had finally been broken. But Naomi didn't have time to reflect on her decision. Within hours, the news broke. The first thing Naomi noticed was the sudden influx of text messages, emails, and calls. At first, they were just the usual messages from colleagues asking for updates on cases, requesting meetings. But then the tone shifted. The messages became more urgent, more frantic. The newsroom alerts popped up on her phone, one after the other. The breaking news. The story was everywhere. Smith & Reynolds was under investigation. The corruption Naomi had uncovered, the very practices she had feared would remain hidden, were now out in the open. The entire city was buzzing with the revelation. Naomi's heart raced as she clicked on the links, her mind racing with disbelief and awe. The journalist had published everything, exposing the payoffs, the cover-ups, the manipulated evidence. There it was, in black and white, for everyone to see. The firm, her colleagues, the very people who had claimed to be her mentors, were now implicated in a massive scandal that would change everything. The article didn't just focus on the firm's illegal activities. It dug deeper into the connections between Smith & Reynolds and the corrupt politicians, law enforcement officials, and business tycoons who had all been complicit in the scheme. Naomi's heart skipped a beat as she read the name of the client she had been assigned to represent. His role in the corruption was laid out in stark detail. Naomi hadn't just uncovered something small. She had uncovered a massive network of criminal activity that stretched across the city. It was bigger than anything she could have ever imagined. The journalists had even found the sealed report Naomi had discovered in the office about the police brutality that had been intentionally covered up by the firm. Naomi's stomach churned as she read the names of the officers involved, realizing with horror that they were the very same people who had ignored her at every turn, who had treated her like a ghost in the office. She had always known they were part of the system that held her down. But now, their faces were laid bare for the entire world to see. Their corruption was no longer a secret. But even as Naomi read the article, her mind was still reeling from the enormity of what she had just done. There was no turning back now. The firm was under fire. The lawyers, the senior associates, everyone who had looked down on Naomi, everyone who had kept her in her place, were now being exposed for who they really were. And Naomi? She was no longer just another associate in the shadows. She was part of the story now, a key player in exposing the truth. Her life had been turned upside down. She had risked everything, but for the first time in years, Naomi felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had done the right thing. Within hours, the story went viral. News outlets exploded with headlines that screamed about the investigation into Smith and Reynolds, each article linking the firm to a massive web of corporate corruption and police bribery. Naomi's phone buzzed constantly as text messages poured in, some from numbers she recognized, others from strangers who had somehow gotten her information. The articles were being shared at lightning speed on social media, people shocked and appalled by the revelations. Naomi couldn't help but feel a strange sense of vindication, an overwhelming confirmation that what she had done was right, even though it was clear that her life would never be the same again. Her colleagues, the ones who had once looked down on her, who had marginalized her contributions, were now murmuring in hushed tones as they hurried around the office. Naomi could hear their gasps, their disbelief, their whispered conversations behind closed doors. Some of them were already trying to distance themselves from the scandal, frantically scrolling through their phones as if pretending to ignore the unfolding disaster would somehow protect them. But there was no denying it anymore. They had been caught. The truth had been laid bare. Naomi didn't need to be told. She knew exactly what was coming. She had seen the playbook before. The firm's strategy would be swift and brutal. Margaret, her supervisor, would be the first to make her move. Margaret was a master of corporate warfare, and Naomi knew that she would stop at nothing to protect the firm's interests, even if it meant destroying Naomi in the process. The way Margaret had manipulated and belittled Naomi over the months now seemed like a calculated effort, a strategy to keep Naomi in line. Naomi had been too naive to see it at the time, too focused on proving herself to realize that she had been a pawn in Margaret's game. But now the tables had turned. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest as she anticipated what was coming next. Margaret's sharp, calculating gaze would soon be fixed on her, and Naomi knew she wouldn't hesitate to destroy her if it meant protecting the firm. Smith and Reynolds was everything to Margaret. Her career, her reputation, her power, it was all tied to the firm's success, and no one could stand in the way of that. Naomi wasn't naive enough to think they would let her walk away unscathed. They would do everything in their power to silence her, to bury the truth before it could spread any further. It wasn't long before Margaret approached Naomi's desk. The office felt suffocating, as if the air had thickened with tension. Naomi's colleagues pretended to be absorbed in their work, but she could feel their eyes on her, could sense the whispers swirling behind her back. Margaret's footsteps echoed down the hallway, each one punctuated by the weight of impending confrontation. Naomi took a deep breath, bracing herself. Naomi, Margaret's voice was cool, composed, but Naomi could hear the undertones of anger, of betrayal. Margaret's eyes were narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I need to speak with you. Now." Without waiting for a response, Margaret turned on her heel and walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking with a menacing rhythm. Naomi followed, her legs heavy as though weighed down by the weight of her decision. She couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding, as if she were walking into the lion's den. She knew that once they were alone, once Margaret had her in a private space, Naomi would be forced to answer for her actions. She had no idea what Margaret had planned, but she knew it wouldn't be good. The elevator doors closed, and Naomi's stomach twisted into knots. The air inside the confined space felt thick and suffocating, each second stretching into eternity. Margaret remained silent, her face unreadable as the elevator descended. Naomi could almost feel the tension radiating off Margaret. She wasn't going to make small talk. This was business, and Naomi had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. When the doors finally opened, Margaret led Naomi down a sterile, brightly lit hallway, the cold fluorescent lights above them flickering as if they were about to burn out. Naomi's mind raced. She couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right choice. The fear of retaliation, the fear of losing everything, gripped her heart. But then she thought of the victims. She thought of the people who had suffered because of the firm's corruption. She couldn't back down now. No matter what Margaret had in store for her, she had to stand firm. They entered a small, windowless conference room. The table was large and intimidating, its cold, polished surface reflecting the harsh overhead lights. Margaret motioned for Naomi to sit across from her. Naomi complied, her palms clammy as she placed them on the table. The silence between them stretched on, each moment more uncomfortable than the last. Naomi could hear her heart beating in her chest, each thud reminding her of the gravity of the situation. Margaret finally broke the silence, her voice icy with disdain. "You've made a huge mistake, Naomi. Do you realize that?" Naomi swallowed, her throat dry. "I did what I had to do." Margaret's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? You think the world is going to reward you for exposing the truth. Well, let me tell you something. This firm will destroy you. We have the power, the resources. Do you honestly think anyone will stand by you once we're through with you?" Naomi's pulse quickened. Margaret's words were harsh, but Naomi refused to let them break her. "I didn't do this for recognition. I did this because it was the right thing to do." Margaret's smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold fury. "Right? Right?" she repeated, as if Naomi's words were absurd. "You've ruined everything. You've jeopardized not only your career but the future of everyone who works here. No one is going to want to hire someone like you. You'll be blacklisted. Do you understand that?" Naomi nodded, her voice steady. "I understand, but it doesn't matter anymore." Margaret slammed her hand down on the table, the force of it echoing through the room. "You don't know what you've done, Naomi. You've made enemies of people you can't even begin to comprehend. People who will make sure you pay for this. Your career, your reputation, your entire future. It's all gone." Naomi sat up straighter, refusing to cower. She had made her choice, and she wasn't going to let Margaret intimidate her into backing down. "Maybe I've lost everything," Naomi said quietly, "but I've saved more lives than you'll ever understand." The tension between them crackled in the air, thick with the weight of their confrontation. Margaret stared at her, her eyes narrowing. For a moment, Naomi thought Margaret might lash out. But then the older woman leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Naomi could see the wheels turning in Margaret's mind. Margaret was calculating, always looking for a way to gain the upper hand, always playing a game. But Naomi had just flipped the board over. Margaret's next words came as a shock. "You may have exposed the truth, Naomi, but you're not the only one with a story to tell. You might have taken down one empire, but you're about to watch another one rise from the ashes. You've given them a reason to make you their next target. Do you really think you can escape this?" Naomi looked Margaret dead in the eye. "I didn't do this to escape. I did it to make sure that one day, the people who caused this corruption are the ones who will fall." Margaret was silent for a long moment, and Naomi could almost hear the gears in her head turning. Then, without another word, Margaret stood up and walked toward the door. She paused just before leaving and turned back to Naomi, her eyes colder than ever. "You'll regret this," she said flatly. Naomi sat there for a long while after Margaret left, staring at the door, her thoughts swirling. She had made the decision. She had exposed the truth. But as the silence pressed in on her, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was just beginning. The firm wouldn't let her go quietly. She had no illusions about that. But she was ready. For the first time in years, Naomi felt as though she could breathe. No matter what came next, she had chosen to fight for something greater than herself. And for the first time, she was no longer afraid. The fallout from Naomi's revelations was swift and brutal. Within days, investigations were launched, both by law enforcement and government agencies, as the full scope of the corruption within Smith & Reynolds came to light. The firm, once a towering beacon of corporate power, found itself embroiled in a web of lawsuits, media scrutiny, and public outrage. The powerful, untouchable figures who had once ruled the firm with impunity were now facing the consequences of their actions. The senior partners, including Margaret, were arrested, their names plastered across the front pages of newspapers and broadcasted on every news outlet. Naomi had, in a sense, won. The corrupt empire that had once oppressed so many had been brought to its knees. But the victory, while satisfying, was not without its costs. Naomi had exposed a rot that went deeper than she had ever imagined, and the reverberations of her actions were felt far and wide. Her life, too, would never be the same. The firm's legal and financial battles raged on, but Naomi's personal journey had taken her to a place of reckoning, a place where she had to decide what truly mattered to her. She left the firm, not just because of the scandal that had engulfed it, but because she had outgrown the very environment that had once felt like her world. She had come to see the firm for what it was, a place where systemic racism, discrimination, and corporate greed were ingrained in the very foundation. Naomi had spent years climbing the ladder, doing everything she could to prove her worth in a space that wasn't built for people like her. She had sacrificed her values, her well-being, and her identity in pursuit of success. But in breaking the chains that bound her to the corporate world, Naomi had realized something crucial. She no longer needed to conform to the expectations of a world that had never truly seen her. In the aftermath of her decision, Naomi spent months reflecting on her journey, on the moments of doubt, the sacrifices she had made, and the people she had left behind in pursuit of a dream that had always been elusive. The oppressive atmosphere at the firm had been stifling, each day feeling like a battle for survival. The systemic racism had not been an abstract concept to Naomi. It had been a lived experience. The casual dismissals, the backhanded compliments, the doors that had been closed to her simply because of her race. Naomi had endured it all. It was a reality that many others had faced too, but no one had dared to speak up. Not until Naomi had broken free. And in breaking the chains, Naomi had found her true calling, not as a corporate lawyer, but as an advocate for justice, fighting for those who had been silenced for far too long. She had come to understand that her passion for justice was not something that could be contained within the walls of a corporate office. It was something that had always burned within her, even when she had buried it beneath the expectations of others. She had been driven by a desire to help people, to speak for those who couldn't, and to challenge the systems that oppressed them. The path that lay ahead wasn't easy. Naomi had to rebuild her life from the ground up, but this time it was on her own terms. She took up causes that were dear to her heart, fighting for marginalized communities, advocating for workers' rights, and challenging the very systems that perpetuated inequality. She joined a nonprofit organization that focused on criminal justice reform and social advocacy, using her legal expertise to fight for those who had been wronged by the system. She became a voice for the voiceless, and though the work was grueling and often disheartening, Naomi knew that it was where she belonged. Naomi also found strength in community. She surrounded herself with people who shared her values, who understood her journey, and who were committed to making real change in the world. In the years that followed, Naomi's voice became one of authority in the fight for justice. She testified before legislative bodies, fought for policy changes, and used her platform to expose corruption and demand accountability. Each time she spoke out, she was reminded of the moment she had taken the first step toward breaking the chains of her past, of leaving behind a life that was suffocating her and embracing a future where she could be free to be herself. The chains of corporate control had shattered, and Naomi was free. She had liberated herself from the constraints of a world that had never accepted her, a world that had tried to mold her into something she was not. In freeing herself, she had found the courage to embrace her true self, the one who was willing to fight for justice, equality, and a better future for all. But Naomi's journey didn't end there. As she continued her advocacy work, she began to realize that her own transformation had sparked a ripple effect. The women and men who had worked alongside her in the firm, those who had been too afraid to speak out, began to find their own voices. They came to Naomi, seeking guidance, sharing their stories, and asking for help in navigating their own battles with the systems that had kept them silent for so long. Naomi became a mentor, a source of inspiration for those who had been held back by fear or uncertainty. She knew that the fight was far from over, but with each person she helped, she felt more empowered to continue the work she had started. The victories were hard-won, and the path forward remained filled with challenges, but Naomi was no longer afraid. The power that had once controlled her was no longer a threat. She had discovered the strength within herself to overcome any obstacle, and with every step, she was rewriting the narrative, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been oppressed, silenced, or made to feel invisible. As she stood before a crowd at a rally one afternoon, speaking about the importance of justice and equality, Naomi felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had fought for freedom, for herself, and for others, and had come out on the other side stronger than she could have ever imagined. The chains of her past had been shattered, and in their place, she had built something more powerful, a life lived with purpose, a life that was finally her own. Naomi had broken the chains, and she would never look back.